I'm Evelyn Skye, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Hahn,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Evelyn Skye.
I'd like to thank some sponsors today before we get into today's awesome interview. If you would like to sponsor the show and highlight your product or service to our audience, go to hankgarner.com and click on the advertise link in the top menu. Thanks to Daniel Arthur Smith and Tales from the Canyons of the Damned. This 19th issue of Tales from the Canyons of the Damned consists of 5 sharp, suspenseful, thought-provoking short stories, each from a different featured master of speculative fiction. Pick up the Halloween edition today. The Future Chronicles by curator and publisher Samuel Peralta. The Future Chronicles has grown from a single collection of robot stories into a series whose unique take on major science fiction and fantasy themes, AI, aliens, time travel, dragons, telepaths, zombies, immortality, galactic battles, cyborgs, doomsday, has made it one of the most acclaimed short story anthology series of the digital era. Pick up something from the Future Chronicles today. ThirdScribe is a web platform built to serve all members of the book community, readers, authors, and publishers. ThirdScribe can help you get the most out of your publishing and reading experience. Connecting readers and writers, give ThirdScribe.com a look today. From Book 1 of the Paragons Trilogy by C. Stephen Manley, When Dark Portals Open, Heroes Will Awaken. Israel Trent is a man living his dream as a crime reporter for the Chicago Tribune. Erin Sims is a young woman whose life is a blur of neon lights, drug-fueled diversions, and being in the wrong places with the wrong people. These two strangers wake up together in a modern-day dungeon with no memory of how they got there and come face-to-face with monsters that neither ever dreamed existed. Rescued by agents of the mysterious Sentry Group, the duo soon find their lives turned upside down. Awakened is the first book of the Paragons Trilogy. It's a gripping origin story filled with mystery, fast-paced action, horrific threats, and bewildering fringe science. If you enjoy an action thriller with a heavy dose of the fantastic, you'll love C. Stephen Manley's Awakened. Essence, Book 1, Septima series by Nick Breaker. Troy, with his irrational fears, is the least likely person to lead a war, but that doesn't mean he can escape his destiny. A trip to New Orleans turns into something much larger when aliens kidnap him and his friends. A perfect doppelganger for their dead General Tomas, Troy is thrust into the front lines of battle against Reptaran invaders. As he struggles to maintain control of his own destiny, Troy knows that no matter the outcome, his life will never be the same. Explore the mind of this unlikely hero in Essence, the first book in a new sci-fi series by Nick Breaker, a coming-of-age tale full of adventure and steamy encounters. Pick up Essence, Book 1 by Nick Breaker today. Music City Macabre by Bob Williams is some of the best action, adventure, horror you'll ever read. Music City will never be the same as you have a front row seat for the end of the world. Give this series a look today. Music City Macabre by Bob Williams. Stay tuned at the end of the show for an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Evelyn Skye on the show with me. Evelyn writes a series of books that are some of the most unique takes on fantasy that I've seen in quite a while. I'm really excited to have her on the show. So welcome to the show, Evelyn.
Thank you so much. I'm really, really appreciating being here and talking to your listeners.
Evelyn, I begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
Oh, that's a really good question. You know, when people think I always wanted to be a writer, my first is to say no, because I think about high school and when you're thinking about your future career, and it didn't occur to me that I wanted to be a writer. But then when I really stop and think about my history growing up, I was always writing. I used to carry around a notebook with me, and I'd write poetry in it when I was in even elementary school and junior high. But my very, very first memory of writing was, I believe in 3rd grade, I wrote a little poem, and it got published in the county anthology. I was taking submissions from all the kids, and that was my first big break, so to speak.
Oh, nice. So many people answer that question, that I didn't necessarily know I wanted to be a writer, but I was always writing. And were you a big book reader when you were younger?
I was a huge reader. I mean, I was the kid who would be happy just curling up on the couch at home. And it was, my parents had to force me to go outside and learn how to play tennis or something, because otherwise I was the definition of sedentary. Like me in a book getting lost in some other world, that was my definition of happiness.
I love it. What were some of the things you were reading that just really captured your imagination?
I think Shel Silverstein was one of those early, kind of whimsical, with a twist of darkness sometimes. That was something I really remember from being young. The Redwall series as well had a huge influence on me. Then as I got older, I mean, now I write kind of in that young adult space, and I like to tell people it's a little bit like Harry Potter meets the Hunger Games. But Maggie Stiefvater is one of my favorites. So she writes the Scorpio Races, the Raven Cycle series, and it's that whole creation of a whole nother world that seems slightly familiar and yet is just a twist enough to give you an escape that I absolutely adore. And I've loved that since I was a kid, and I love it now, and that's what I read and that's what I write.
Shel Silverstein doesn't get talked about enough, I don't think. What a prolific writer, and what a wide writer. He wrote everything from children's books to essays for Playboy to folk songs and country songs. Just crazy prolific, all over the place.
Yeah, I think that he was such a big part of the English literature education when I was a child, and it has faded away. I don't see his books as often. There's still it's still on every library bookshelf and in the bookstores, but I have a third grader now, and she hasn't encountered his poetry in class, and I don't know if it's just it's a generational thing. It's the feel, and the kids aren't into that feel anymore, and I feel like it's a shame. It's a real shame.
I feel like we need to fix that, Evelyn.
Well, let's do it. I think after this podcast, this is our new mission. Everyone, go out and pick up Shel Silverstein and tell every child you know.
That's right. That's right. So you were a big fan of fantasy. What was it? Do you think? And I love. So many writers begin reading and writing fantasy, and they may even go on to other genres. But it just seems like there's this special link with readers and fantasy, and wanting to go to another world, and the idea that magic is real, and there are creatures and people that are kind of larger than life. What do you think about that, Evelyn? What do you think it is about fantasy that just really resonates with us so much?
I think, one, like you said, it is an escape from the real world, and sometimes reality is a little bit harsh, and we want someplace else to go. I had someone recently who was talking about my book, and she's been going through a rough time, and there's a certain magic in this book that can kind of transport you temporarily someplace. It's kind of like being in a dream, but it feels real, and you can walk around in it. And she said that she wished that she could have that in real life, but it was nice to have it just for a few hours, right? So I think escape is definitely one thing. I definitely felt that way as a child too. It was just a nice place to run away from reality, but also a nice place to let your imagination grow, right? And think about the things that could be. And I think the second thing, at least for me, is that fantasy and, delving into these other worlds, it's hope, actually. It's, no matter how dark the story might be, there's still this, optimism and hope, right, in these epic quests. You're always striving for something better. And then the magic, it's like taking our lives and seeing it in a slightly different way. And then that translates back into your real life. When you're done with that story, when you're done watching that Lord of the Rings movie, you're back here, and all of a sudden you get to see a little bit of magic in your real life, and it's that hope and that optimism for me that I love.
Yeah, and even in dark fantasy, and there's it's kind of grim dark, and things like that, we still get to see people act heroically. And I think that's what I love about fantasy so much, is, and even the broad range of fantasy, we still get to pick out some archetypes that I think that we as people need to see sometimes. And even if their characters are very flawed, it's just nice to watch someone go through something and maybe rise above a little bit.
Absolutely. It's like seeing the best of a person, right? And it's really, I can't think of the word right now. I'm blanking, but it's like, you see someone who's flawed, like all of us, and none of us are perfect. We're just so very, very human. And yet, through this hardship, through this darkness, you find your best self, and you find other people who are good, and it makes me happy,
Right. Evelyn, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Southern California in a couple of towns, Upland and Claremont. So Upland is not well known, but Claremont is right next to it, and it's where a bunch of colleges are.
Okay. Did you have any idea? I know you were a big reader and you were telling stories, but did you ever imagine yourself as a published author and doing what you do today?
No, this came to me late. I mean, when you're in high school, people start pressuring you into thinking about what you're going to be when you grow up. And I had no idea. Like, I did well in school. I had, I had friends and I had clubs that I was in, and I had interests, but I never felt like I had a calling. Like, I knew some kids who, from age 12, wanted to be lawyers or doctors or astronauts. And I didn't feel anything like that. I just had a bunch of things I enjoyed, and, reading and writing were among those. But it didn't occur to me that that was a career, and that may partly just be my cultural upbringing. So I'm Chinese American, and while my parents are not like the traditional, immigrant story where they pressure you to have to become a doctor or engineer, it still wasn't part of what I grew up thinking, that a writer is an actual profession, So I ended up going to college and kind of just dabbling. And like I said, luckily my parents were very open with what I wanted to do, and they let me major in Russian literature and history.
Which is a natural thing. Which is a natural thing for a Chinese American to want to study.
It is so completely random, and I'm so lucky that they said, yeah, okay, if that's what you want to do, go for it. But my grandmother, who is very traditionally Chinese, because she actually told my mother, what are you letting her do? She is going to starve to death. And this is actually in the dedication to my second book, The Crown State. It's to my parents because they let me do this. And when my grandmother said that, my mom said, don't worry, Evelyn will find a way. And somehow that totally that became my degree, came back years later, and that's what I ended up doing. But, before that, I went to law school, because after I graduated with this quote-unquote useless degree, because I wasn't going into academia, I didn't know what to do, and all I had was a job offer from the C.I.A. and law school admissions. So I decided, I guess I'd better quote-unquote grow up. And I went to law school, and I was a lawyer for 6 years. And it wasn't until I had my daughter and I realized that this law firm life, where I went to work at, 8:30 in the morning and didn't know if I was coming home at 6 p.m. or 3 in the morning, wouldn't work for me anymore, that I got to slow down a little bit. I picked up reading again, because I hadn't had time to read in a long time. And I thought, maybe I'm going to try writing. Let's see what happens. And that's when I realized that this was the job, and this is the career that I wanted, that I was meant for.
Evelyn, there's so much for me to pick apart in everything you just said there, but let's start with Russia, because the Crown's Game and the Crown's Fate are pieces of this beautiful story that are Russian history with magic, and I was intrigued to find out after I began reading The Crown's Game that you actually had a degree in Russian history, and that naturally bleeds over into the books. And then when you read the books, you see the natural progression of how this was obviously going to happen for you. But as a late teenager, when you're finishing high school and going off to college, why Russia? What was the draw there? What was the what captivated you about it?
So I was reading, this is recent, I was reading Amy Poehler's memoir, and she was saying that she actually had a very happy childhood. And so then she would invent these really dark stories for herself, so that she could feel some darkness. And that struck me because I think that's kind of what I was like. I had a very happy childhood, but everyone has a dark side, right? And so when I was a senior in high school in literature class, our teacher had us read Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. And there was this incredible, deep Russian angst that I hadn't encountered before. And then anyone who's read any Russian literature, will know what I'm talking about. And that attracted me. And so when I got to college, I just decided, maybe I'll take a literature class and a language class. And this teacher, hilariously, the Russian department was, I think, underfunded. This is my theory. They never told me that. But this teacher wanted to get more students in. And she said, it's a language class. If you show up for all 5 classes a week, you will get some form of an A automatically, because it's really about participation. So A plus, A, or A minus if you show up. And I thought, well, that sounds like a pretty good deal. And so I signed up. And then it was just this incredible faculty, and they were so warm, and because there weren't that many of us, it felt like a family. And so it started with a language, and then there were more literature classes, and it was more of this kind of let's tap into this dark soul that is part of Russia's identity, and that's how I ended up becoming having a Russian degree.
I love it. So you became kind of mesmerized with the with Russian literature and the starkness of it, and you're right. It is it's a stark contrast to our typical American upbringing, and I think we really can't, weigh out what it must have been like to grow up under. I don't know. We're just so privileged in literature like that shows us another world can really not only open our eyes but really weigh heavily on us.
Yeah, and I actually had this really eye-opening conversation with my friend who lives over there. He's a Russian guy. He was trying to learn English as a teenager, and I was trying to shore up my Russian, and so we became pen pals. Way back when all we had on the internet was America Online, and so we were doing the instant America Online, like AIM instant messaging it. But we had this great friendship. But at one point he said that the Russian philosophy in life is that everything sucks, but if something good happens, then hey, cool, that's a nice surprise. And it's such an opposite to the American, I think, point of view, how we see the world, which is well, there's all this happiness for us to pursue. And studying Russian and learning about the culture and the history, it really helped me understand people more, I think. And I think that informs the characters that I write, and it's just kind of changed the way that I see the world in a very good way.
So you finish college, you've got this this degree in Russian studies, and your parents were there for you and said, Evelyn's going to figure this out. Tell me about this job offer from the C.I.A.
It's always, people like to ask about it because it sounds terribly interesting, but then I tell them and they're disappointed. It was a desk job at Langley translating open source information. So basically what happened was the C.I.A. had let go of too many of their Russian specialists after the Soviet Union fell. And then around the time I was graduating from college, they realized, oh, wait, we actually still need. Although at that time they weren't one of the big superpowers anymore, they were still a presence. And so they needed people to translate newspapers and magazines and, the online articles that were being published. Kind of let's say what is out there today on Russia Today, which is one of their big news outlets. They'd need people in the C.I.A. to be translating that. What are the Russians talking about, just so that they'd know. But it wasn't like a secret spy kind of job.
Did you consider that at all?
I thought about it, but then my mom had also said, all right, well, as a backup, in case you can't get a job, because I was out here in Silicon Valley and the bubble was on the brink of bursting, she said maybe you should take the LSAT and just have a law school as a backup. And so I did that, and I got some acceptance letters, and I thought, I could be just behind a desk doing this and not knowing where this job is going to go, or I could go to law school, and that's probably something that's, a degree that's worth having. It's not a bad backup to be able to be a lawyer if things don't work out.
Sure, sure. Did you enjoy studying law or then practicing law?
Oh, no, I hated it. I hated it so much.
I love it.
I mean, I think this is why there are so many lawyers who end up quitting, is because we were all liberal arts majors and we had nowhere else to go. So we went to law school, and it's just such a terrible fit. But a lot of us actually end up being writers, surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly.
Yeah, I've encountered quite a few on the show. There are a couple of threads of commonality that run through a lot of episodes, and one is that there are a lot of writers who are also actors or maybe frustrated actors, and the other one is lawyers, and they're always frustrated lawyers.
I can see that, absolutely.
So you say that your daughter was born, and you kind of had a breather, and you got to take a pause from the law career, and you started reading again. Was that the initial catalyst that kind of cranked your imagination back up?
It was, and this is a little bit embarrassing to admit, but it was the Twilight series by Stephanie Meyer.
Well, that's been a gateway drug for a lot, so.
It was, right. I think it was one of those things where it was good, and then it got too popular, and it jumped the shark, and so now people like to put it down. But she can really write a page turner, and I thought, it doesn't seem that hard. I think I'm going to give it a shot. So little did I know that writing was actually quite difficult, because I thought that I would be like, a cajillionaire like Stephanie Meyer within a year once reading, and that didn't happen. But it got me started, so thank you, Stephanie Meyer.
Yeah, you bring up a great point, and that people love to kind of trash on anything that gets popular, and and we can discuss whether something is quality literature, and if it resonates deeply enough and hits all the right literary points and all of that stuff. But the way I look at it is, if it brings someone into the fold and makes a reader out of them, then more power to them. I will not be the one to disparage someone from writing their story, getting it out there, and maybe one day you write something better, and you keep improving your craft just like everybody else does.
Absolutely, and I think as writers we hope that we keep getting better, right? I mean, like, part of us cringe when, your second or third or fourth book comes out and someone says, like, oh, yeah, I like this better than your others. And you think, oh, but I thought my other one was good, too. But at least, the feedback is you're getting better. But to your point, as long as it gets people reading and it gives them something, like an entertainment, then I think that's great. And I think that there are different kinds of literature, that serve different purposes. There are the ones that really, really make you think. And then there are the ones that just whisk you away on this whirlwind plot, and they all serve different purposes. And from a writing perspective too, there's so much craft that goes into every kind of book. And just because somebody might be really good at writing setting description doesn't mean that they're great at plot. And someone else might be fascinating at writing deep characters. And there are merits, and incredible when any author can do any aspect of that extraordinarily well.
Yeah, absolutely. So you had this time off. You were beginning to read again. What was that first idea that you had? That I'm going to write a book, and kind of how did that come on you, and what did you do with that initial desire?
So my first idea was, just to give a brief overview of my journey to having a book published, I wrote 8 manuscripts that were unpublished before I got to the Crown's Game. And there was this long, winding journey. But the first idea that I had was actually related to my Russian background and the fantasy that I loved. So I decided to write a time travel story that was half set in 19th century Imperial Russia and half set in modern times. And so what it was, there was a boy back in 19th century Russia, and he discovers a time portal. And when he was growing up, there was this little girl he used to play with, and she was a princess, but then she just disappeared one day, and no one knew what happened to her. So now as a teenager, he goes through this portal. He ends up in modern-day California, and he's trying to figure this place out, but then he also stumbles upon this girl. And it turns out that she is the lost princess, but she doesn't remember her childhood either because she disappeared when she was very young. And so that was the writing, and it was enough story that it got a lot of literary agents' attention, but my writing itself was still very, very green, and it wasn't good. So it was like good concept, but the writing did not hold up. But I wrote that whole book, and I edited it a few times, and it's on my computer permanently, probably for no one to see, but it was a good first start.
Well, you and 8 million other people have, a stack of unfinished or unpublished books, in the drawer, so to speak. And that's good. That's a good place to be. That means you were writing the words, and, that's, you can never discount, that time spent writing those stories.
Absolutely. I feel like it's all part of the journey, right? I mean, there's no manuscript that you write that is actually a failure because you're learning the entire time, and it's part of what gets you to where you end up.
Well, Evelyn, do you know, I bet if you had a room with 100 people in it and you polled the room, I'll bet 90% or better would say, yeah, they feel like they have a book in them. And then,
absolutely.
And out of that 100 people, maybe one or two will have actually written a book from start to finish. So whether that book is published or not, if you make it to the end, you have done something, you're in the top 1 or 2 percentile of people that will ever accomplish that.
Yeah, it is such a major, major accomplishment. And I think people don't realize that because everyone likes to say they have a book in them, like you said, but to actually sit down and write it, whether it's just a first draft or whether, how far it goes, it's just an amazing accomplishment that everyone should absolutely celebrate.
Yeah. And one of the best things to learn in those desk drawer novels is just getting from beginning to end. That's a skill that can only be learned by actually doing it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So did you go back to work as a lawyer as you were pursuing your writing, or was this something that you decided, okay, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do it until I make it?
So I had kind of kept the law firm I was working at, like I was stringing them along, saying, well, I'm just going to go on unpaid leave now that my maternity leave is over, and I intend to come back while I tried writing. And then once I started writing, I just thought, oh my God, I love this so much. Like, I have never felt more in the right place. I've never felt this kind of joy as I have with writing. And so I just thought, you know what? I worked hard as a lawyer for a while. I saved some money. Let's use that and see if I can do this. And so then I finally told them, you know what? I'm not coming back. It took me a while to have the guts to introduce myself to people when I met you as a writer and not as a lawyer who also I'm writing a book or I'm trying to write a book. But I just, once I did that and I was all in, that's where, those 8 manuscripts came out. Like, let's do it and let's try. And it just feels right. And it feels like for once what people talk about when they say, I wake up in the morning and I'm so happy that I get to do what I do.
Exactly. So The Crown's Game was the first book that was published. When you were writing that book, did you have any idea that this was going to be the book that would be the breakthrough?
So it's interesting because yes and no. So I'd written so much before that had not been published, and I had been with an agent for several years, and we had tried to get my book into publishers, several books for several years, and it was always, the editors always said, like, well, I like it, but, and there was always a but. And so I was on the brink of quitting now, right? Like, I just talked about, like, how this was a job that I loved, except that after years of rejections, you kind of think, maybe I'm delusional, right? And so I was about to quit, but one of my other author friends, she said, like, Evelyn, you have talent and you have the drive. You can do this. Please don't quit. Just keep going. And I thought, you know what? Fine. I'm going to write what I now call my spite book, This is the book that I wrote that it wasn't what I thought the market wanted. It wasn't what I thought editors would want to publish or readers would want to read. I said, I'm going to write everything that I want to write, and it's going to be this crazy book, and it's going to be a fantasy, and it's going to be set in real Imperial Russia because that's what I love, and it's going to have this crazy magic that is different from what normal people think is magic, and I don't even know what the rules are for writing fantasy. I'm just going to write the fantasy that I want to read, and it's going to be like the kind of fantasy where if you're not a huge high fantasy reader, this is the kind of book that you'd pick up and it would ease you into the world. And so I wrote this book that I thought was insane and maybe no one would want to write it, but it was, I'm going to write this and I will show you that I don't deserve to be published and then I will quit. Except that I think when I let go of all those boundaries, all the like stress and expectations I'd put on myself for the past years, something just came out that was pure, and it was me, and it was also all those other manuscripts, all that experience, finally like gelling. And as I wrote it, this book, the Crown Scheme just tumbled out the first draft in 36 days, and it was insane, and my fingers could not keep up with my brain. And as I was writing it, then I thought, oh my gosh, this Spite book, I think this Spite book might be actually the book.
Wow. You said the book just poured out in 36 days. Did you have an idea of the story ahead of time? Did you outline it out, or was it just, were you just kind of pouring the story out as you kind of discovered it?
So for me, what happens when I come up with a new idea is I hear a first line. So the very first line of a book kind of comes to me, and that sets the tone for the book. So I understood the feel of the book, and then I start to discover the main characters. And other than that, I don't really outline. Like, I have a very general sense of what the book is. So I knew that there was going to be Vika and Nikolai, and there would be enchanters pitted against each other in a duel to the death. And someone would become the winner, and that would be the Tsar's Imperial Enchanter, and someone would die. And that's basically all I knew. And then I just started writing, and it feels organic that way, because I've tried outlining in the past, and then within one or two chapters, the story's gone sideways and it's following the characters. And so I've just given up on outlining.
I would imagine, one of the toughest things about writing fantasy is the world building, and because you're having to build everything from scratch. It's an all new world, and it may have elements that the reader's familiar with, so that everything is not completely askew. But there's a lot of world building that has to go in it. Now, with you setting this in 1800s Russia, and it's real Russia, it's actual Russia, that just has a magic element thrown in. I would imagine, because you are so deeply immersed in Russian history, that the story probably flowed a lot easier for you because the world building was already all in your head. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. People have asked me how I did research for it, and I kind of laugh because I didn't really do research until I realized that I studied, this subject in college. So I actually did years of research. I just didn't know it. But yeah, the world was there, and it was just layering on the magic, really.
So tell me about the magic system that you introduced into this world. What is it that takes this historical fiction and makes it fantasy?
So it is. So there's these. Russia has lost its belief in magic in this story, and so most people don't know that it exists. And then there's always an enchanter who can do magic, and he or she works for the Tsar. And that is like their secret weapon, basically, because no one else in the world knows that this magic exists. Only Morocco in this world still believes in magic. But Russia has this secret weapon, and so their enchanter can do things. They can create weather that will defeat their enemies. And that's the basis for what this world is. And what I liked about that was that in our real world, we don't believe in magic either. And there are glimpses of things that Vika or Nikolai do, and people just explain them away with logic. Oh, there's this magic coming out of the water. It must be that the Tsar had a bunch of engineers come and put fountains in overnight. And even though it's an absolutely ridiculous explanation that engineers could possibly do that in the middle of the night, that is what people do. That's what we do. And I like that kind of sparks this thought, like, wait a second, what magic is happening in our real world that we are not seeing because we're purposely blinding ourselves to it. So that's like the basis of the magic in this world. And Vika has elemental magic, so she does great things with nature. And Nikolai is her opponent, and he is much more mechanical. He works with bridges and he builds things. So they fight it out, and it's all layered on top of this world where people are like, oh wow, that's really cool.
I love that you're kind of exploring people that have kind of lost their belief in magic. And one of the things I love about fantasy is especially urban fantasy and portal fantasy, is that there's always this theme that there's something else going on behind the scenes. And in our typical day-to-day life where things can be wonderful or not, it's always nice to think that there's something else going on. Did you have any is this story a metaphor for anything for you, or are you just really enjoying kind of introducing some fantastical things into a typical ordinary situation?
I think that it's a little bit of both. I don't tend to be like the heavy-handed writer who comes in with a quote-unquote theme that I want people to pick up on. But I think that as a writer, what happens is a lot of you gets poured into the book subconsciously, and you don't realize it. And so one of the themes that my agent picked up on so I had a previous agent and I left him and I went out with the Crown team looking for a new agent and then a new publisher. And the agent who I ended up choosing, she said she fell in love with the book because there was a kindness to the characters that she wasn't accustomed to seeing in so many stories. And when she said that, it made me smile. It made me realize how important that is to me too. That a lot of times we spend our time pursuing our own goals, but it's really important to stop and consider how that impacts others as well. So when I write, I end up, I think, sometimes seeing things afterwards, but I don't intentionally put them in there.
Well, and I think that's the best way, is when you notice theme and not when you set out to interject theme.
Exactly.
Yeah. Because those things that maybe we're thinking about, or maybe personally wrestling with, or just something that we find important, those things are naturally going to come out. I mean, we've all read books where the author had an agenda and it's right there on the page. You can cut it with a knife.
Right.
So I find it really interesting that you left your agent that you had submitted so many with, and went for a new agent with this book. Was that because this was a last ditch effort for you, or did you kind of realize, okay, this is a special project and I really want to have a fresh pair of eyes and maybe someone with a fresh commitment to me and my writing? Was any of that involved?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely that, but also, so I talked about how I'd written 8 different stories, and it was this meandering journey for me. So I started out, my first couple of books that I tried to write were fantasy, and then after that I thought, maybe I'm not getting anywhere because fantasy is not my thing. Obviously, I suck at world building. So I decided that what I needed to do was write contemporary social justice stories because, I knew a little bit about that because I was a lawyer and I had friends, who were out there, doing good things for the world, public defenders, people at the Innocence Project in New York, working on cases for people who are wrongly committed of crimes. And so I thought, okay, well, I'm going to tackle these issues instead, and then I don't have to deal with world building because we exist in this world and people know it. So I wrote a bunch of stories like that, and the agent that I was with first, that was his specialty. He worked on realistic contemporary fiction. So, so we, failed to sell several of my books over several years. And when I decided to write this last-ditch effort, and it was going to be a fantasy, I also decided I needed another agent who specialized more in fantasy, because it's not only knowing how to help me as an author craft the story, it's also which editors do you know? Like what publishers do you have relationships with that actually deal with fantasy? Because the contemporary context that previous agent had would have been the wrong ones for this story. And then like you said, it's also just kind of, this is my last shot that I'm giving myself. Let's go all out. Let's go completely fresh, somebody else, fresh eyes, and let's see what happens.
So what was the process like for getting it published? So you get the new agent. Is she really excited about it? And where did it finally land?
Yeah, so she and I just did like one quick round of edits, and then we sent it out. We sent it on submission right before Thanksgiving. So that's about the time when everyone says, don't send your manuscripts out to editors because the publishing houses are getting ready to shut down for the holidays. Everyone's got their own thing going on. But, we were excited about this book, and we thought that it would get people's attention, even if it was that they had to read it over a holiday break. So sent it out to a few editors. There was one editor from Penguin who I had met at a conference before I even switched agents, and she had read the opening of an early draft of The Crown's Game shortly after I finished that whirlwind 36-day writing spree. And so she was already interested in it, so I knew that. So she was one of the editors that we sent to. But we sent to all the major houses, too. And so what ended up happening was, as Thanksgiving passed and then we rolled into the winter holidays, my agent started getting phone calls. And so we ended up with an editor at HarperCollins who was super excited, and they made a preemptive offer on my book. And but then the Penguin editor and then someone from Random House wanted to get in on it too. So we were about to go to auction, which is basically like every writer's dream, right? This is the story that I tell when I go to writing conferences, and everyone's eyes light up, and they're like, "Oh my God!" And we were about to go to auction, and I was excited about this whole bidding war kind of thing. But the editor at Harper just really, really wanted the book, so they came back with another preempt that was 50% higher than their first offer.
Hello.
And they exactly right. And at first we had gone out with this thinking, well, let's try to sell The Crown's Game as a standalone book, because I was an unknown author. Publishers don't necessarily like to sink a bunch of money into somebody that they don't know how they're going to do. So, but when Harper came back, they said, okay, here's an even better offer, and we're going to do 2 books. Like, we'll guarantee this as a duology. And so my agent and I talked it over, and we said, this is crazy. And also, there's just something to be said about when it clicks and somebody just loves a project so much and they understand the characters much, that we went for it, And earlier we'd gotten a response from another editor from who was the editor of this huge fantasy series, and she said she loved my books, but she wished it were more violent, like just much bloodier. And my agent and I were both like, God, it's so tempting, but that's just not what the book is about. Yes, it's life or death, but there's so much more that mentioned. And so we had said no to that. So then when, this offer came in from Harper, and the editor, Kristen Renz, who is my editor now, she just loved it, and she got it. And when she talked about what she wanted to help, how to refine the book, it was exactly what I was thinking and hoping for, but didn't know how to do myself. And so we said, okay, the auction is off. Preempt offer, we will take it. And that was how it all began.
Oh, man. And if you would have taken the advice of that other editor, this would not be the same book.
No, it would be completely different. She said what she wanted was something much more Hunger Games-like. And I have an element of danger and battle in the book, but I also wanted to focus on the human element of it.
Right. Well, and, you also talked earlier about kind of trying to write toward what you thought the market wanted. And then even this editor wanted you to take your book and make it more like what was on the market and something that maybe readers would be instantly familiar with. Maybe that's the reasoning. And what a dangerous precedent that if we always followed the market. And I know there's lots of writers who write specifically to a market, and they have an audience, and that does very well for them. But we would never get anything different and new and challenging if that were the only thing that ever got published. What a sad thought.
Yeah, I agree. And like you said, it's great that we have people who are, who are writing their specialty. And, but I also think it's good to have something new, right? And I think that my strange little book actually ended up doing well because it was different. And sometimes you need to just push yourself and say, I'm going to do this weird thing, and we'll see. And maybe people will like this, crazy idea that I hatched when I was going to quit.
Yeah, for sure. So you went from writing 8 books that never did anything to landing on the New York Times bestsellers list. What was that feeling like?
It was mind-boggling, and even now, when you just said that, I just started grinning, and you get this feeling in your chest, like, oh my God, I can't believe it. That's me, and I wrote this thing, and people, like, tens and thousands of people are reading it, and it's still such a dream. It is such a dream, and yet, when I talk to aspiring authors, I tell them, like, there's so much hard work that went into it, and so when you have that moment where your book is published and you see it, online or on a shelf, just be proud and remember how hard you worked for it and that you deserve it, and there's a lot of things we can't control, but wow, yeah, what a feeling.
So how did you follow up The Crown's Game? There's a sequel to it out now, and how far into the process were you before you started working on the sequel? And was the publisher excited to get a sequel when they started seeing how well this book was doing?
Yeah, so we always knew that there was going to be a sequel, but I didn't start working on it until we had finished all the major edits on The Crown's Game, just because I knew how much could change in the process. For example, there's a character in The Crown's Game, Juliana, and she's the princess. She literally had 2 lines in the book when my editor and HarperCollins bought the book. And so my editor said, I think Juliana has a lot of potential. Let's draw her out. And so we ended up developing her, and she becomes a big part of the book. And if I had started writing the sequel without knowing that, the sequel would have been a completely different book, because she ends up having a big role in the sequel as well. So it was very much a collaborative effort with my editor to craft the sequel and make sure that it was the right kind of book to follow up. Like I said, I don't outline. So I actually wrote an entire version of The Crown's Fate and sent it to my editor, and I thought it was the greatest thing ever. And she read it, and she said, "This is a really good book, but it is the wrong book. It's the wrong kind of fantasy," which I hadn't thought about. But I set up The Crown's Game as, it was focused on one place and on these characters, and it was about their battle, but it was also about the people involved. And the second book that I wrote, the first draft, ended up being, a quest kind of fantasy. They're off to find things. And she said, your readers are going to be very confused. And that was a really good lesson for me as an author. Like, you, as a writer, make a promise to the readers when they pick up a book, and they expect something from you. They expect a certain kind of book, certain characters. And when they want to continue in that series, they expect more of the same. And you can't just switch it on them, because they will be very unhappy. So I threw away that draft. I started all over again, and then eventually we came out with what became The Crown's Fate, the sequel.
Is the story complete in these 2 books, or will you visit this world again?
So the story is complete for the novel series for now. I would be happy to write more, and I've got other ideas percolating in my head. So, if the right opportunity comes up, then I would be very happy to revisit it. But, you asked if I had been working on the sequel before and whether my editors were happy. What I did when we were working on The Crown's Game in edits, and I would have some breaks, is I started working on another book, a brand new series. And so the Harper actually ended up buying that series too, so that one is coming out in about a year or so. I'm still working on it right now, but yeah, it's called Circle of Shadows. It's a ninja-inspired fantasy, so that's kind of where my head is right now.
Oh, nice. You started working on that book in the midst of or before starting Crown's Fate. How important is that, do you think, for a writer to kind of shift gears sometimes, give your brain a break from the project you're working on, go do something different? Do you think when you come back to finish the sequel, is your mind freed up a little bit to pursue the story again now that you've kind of stepped away from it?
Yeah, I don't know about how important it is to be writing like a completely different project, but I think it's important to give your brain a break and to do other things. Like if you are not published yet and you have a project out and you're looking for an agent, or your agent is out looking for a publisher for you, it is good to be working on something else just to keep your mind off, because otherwise you will get so singularly obsessed with whether or not your email is dinging and why it's not dinging, and it will make you insane. But once you're in the shoot and you're actually working on a book that's about to be published, I actually find it quite difficult to switch back and forth. And so there was a point in time where I was working on both Circle of Shadows and the Crown's Game edits, and then there was even an overlap at one point where I was doing copy edits on the Crown's Game and then working on actual revisions and writing the Crown's Fate, and then dabbling in Circle of Shadows, in the breaks in between. And it was really hard to keep the story and the characters straight. So now if I can, I just work on one series at a time. And then once I've turned something in, I just take a break and I catch up on reading, and I catch up on all the errands in my life, like actually going to the grocery store and feeding my family, those kinds of things. And it's good. It's important to stop and live your real life too.
Right. Evelyn, I'm a huge fan. The Crown's Game is a wonderful read. I highly recommend it to everyone. If some new listeners are just discovering you for the first time on the show, where can they find you online and follow you and get plugged into your work?
Yeah, awesome. I love connecting with new readers. I have a website. It's www.evelynskye.com. And there's a lot of content there about my books, where you can get them. There's a lot of extras, like fan-made book trailers. There's also my fan club, the Sky Guard, which is a really fun thing. It's basically contest giveaways, exclusive behind-the-scenes content. And if you sign up for that, I don't spam you. I only send you stuff if there's something exciting. So that's a good way to connect with me. I'm also on Twitter at Evelyn Skye YA. And I'm on Instagram at Evelyn_Skye.
Wonderful. Evelyn, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. It has been a real joy.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.